All right. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Hiatt Jackson from the Flood Innovation Center, the University of Hull. We are an organization that was formed to deliver ERDF funding to local businesses and businesses in transition areas in England to support innovation in flood resilience products and processes and services, as well as now we are able to support businesses to increase their own property flood resilience through survey and implementation of property flood resilience or PFR measures. So I'm going to start off today with a little bit of housekeeping. You all see the housekeeping slide? Just making sure my tech's working. Yeah, good. Okay, so we are recording today. It's very likely that we'll reuse the presentations or repost the presentation separately on YouTube, as we tend to get a lot of people asking to see specific content from these. So it's nice to have that available. We probably keep you muted, but if you can just make sure that you're muted as well. We've done this as a meeting today and not a webinar because we would like to encourage some discussion, which I'll talk about in a second. It's going to be about 90 minutes long. We'll attempt to keep to the schedule. It will depend on how much conversation is generated. If you have any questions that you just want to ask while somebody else is talking, you can use the chat function. When we're doing the group discussion and Q&A, please feel free to use the reactions button, which looks like a little smiley face with a plus, to raise your hand, or you can just do it conversationally. And there's not a huge amount of us on today, which is nice, because then we can actually have some two-way conversation. And if you wish to share your personal data with the group, you're welcome to do that within the chat, or you can, if there's somebody specific that you would like to carry on a conversation with outside of the webinar, just let us know and we'll try and see if they are amenable to that, to getting in contact. That's my housekeeping. So today we are looking at getting your business flood ready and talking about our newest capability as a program to help businesses to increase their own property flood resilience. And we're going to talk today about how those measures can help your business thrive in the face of rising flood risk due to climate change. This is just sort of a general overview of what we're talking about today. We'll attempt to keep to the schedule, but you know how things are. We're going to be starting with some personal flooding experiences, one of which we have someone to speak to us today, which is Saphia, and we've got a video as well that sort of focuses more on the effects of it to an SME of flooding. And then a group discussion, and then I'll go over some PFR stuff and Cecilia, and tell you a little bit more about what the Flood Innovation Center does. And Cecilia is going to talk to us about flood risk. And then we can have another opportunity to discuss those things. And then Rob is going to give us a little overview of how flood surveys are done, which is an extremely important part of the process. Right, so I'm going to hand over now, without further ado, to Saphia. Saphia, I've got your slides. Is it all right just to let me know when you want me to move on?
Sure, that's fine. That's easier, yes.
Okay, great.
I'll do my best Chris Whitty impression.
Yeah. I'll try and be on the ball for you as well.
Well, this is just really a quick I guess a quick idea of what it was like living with the floods in 2007 when they came to Hull. I'm a third year PhD candidate at the university, and my subject is climate change migration. So I look at how people are forced to move as a result of various climate change impacts. Could I have the next slide, please? So I was living in Hull back in 2007 when the city had quite significant floods as a result of very heavy rainfall. People who were around at the time might remember that one person unfortunately died in the city. It was estimated that more than 10,000 homes were affected, and almost all of the city's 98 schools were flooded too. So obviously a lot of families, a lot of children impacted for quite a number of months. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of Newland Avenue, which is just around the corner from the university, and it's an area, it's where I live now. I live just opposite where this picture was taken, actually, and it's an area with a lot of young families and a lot of students. So at the time in 2007, I was living round the corner from here, actually, and in a first floor flat. And I woke up really in the morning of the flooding to my neighbour downstairs shouting. So he was in the sort of basement flat, and he had woken up in bed, soaking wet, because the water had reached the level of his mattress. Obviously we went to bed not knowing that anything was imminent, that we were expecting any floods, and you know, he woke up soaking wet. Now during the course of the day, I think it was, if I remember rightly, 25th of June, it was the middle of summer, the water in his property rose to about 4 feet high. So obviously destroying absolutely everything that he owned, and a very, very scary experience for him. Now my flat was directly above, and it wasn't flooded, but the water had a really terrible impact on the building, on the fabric of the building. And the damp rose up through the floor, up through the walls, and really caused a lot of damage, to the point where my property was not habitable any longer and needed, you know, huge amounts of work. And I left altogether, and I went to stay with my brother, and basically spent 6 months in his living room, you know, sleeping in his living room while I was trying to find a new place to live. And it was during that period that I actually decided to leave Hull altogether, and I moved down to London at that point and spent a number of years living and working down there. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is a rather grainy picture taken in the rain, but this is the path outside my mother's house, so my family home. And this is also off Newland Avenue. And you can see in the photo, it's still raining heavily, but the water at this point was already, you know, a couple of feet high. In my mother's house, she had standing water in the downstairs rooms and underneath the floor. She had to move in with a friend for 6 months while the property was dried out and extensive work was done to replace the plaster on the walls, replace the entire kitchen, which had completely rotted, the rotted floors, electrics, carpets, fixtures and fittings. And she was luckier than a lot of people in Hull, actually, because her insurance paid for all of these repairs, which were, the cost was in excess of £30,000, which is an amount that she never could have afforded if she hadn't been insured. Now, when I moved back to Hull in 2020, I was obviously aware that our new house, being in the area off Newland Avenue, was in a place that had previously flooded and was at risk of future flooding. Now, interestingly, this was despite the fact that, according to the paperwork that we received when we bought the house, there was no record of any flooding in that area, or of the house ever having been flooded itself. Now, I can remember walking down the street and seeing the standing water, and when we looked around the house, we noticed that the floors had been replaced in the last 15 years. So it was very suspicious to say that, you know, nothing had ever taken place there. So I would definitely recommend to anybody not taking at face value, you know, advice that you might get from solicitors regarding flooding when you, and basically do your own investigations when you're buying a new property or a new business property. We decided to go ahead with the purchase anyway, and we got in a surveyor to advise us on the steps that we could take to mitigate the risk from flooding in the future. It was a really helpful local company that came and advised us, and they charged a couple of £100 to do a thorough building survey and flood survey. Now, there's limited things you can do, obviously, if you're living on a floodplain, but they advised us to unblock the air bricks and to install what they call a French drain around the back of the house. Could I have the next slide, please? Because this is a picture taken a couple of days ago in our garden, and this is what's called a French drain. So it's basically a channel that you dig, which is filled with gravel, and this channels the water away from the walls of your house. So we have this running around the whole of the back of the house, and it was installed by a local building firm. It was, again, a few £100, not hugely expensive, and it won't protect our house from a severe flood scenario, but it has already saved us during several instances of heavy rainfall from having standing water either in the garden or rainwater entering into the air bricks. So it's quite a cheap and effective method for like a medium risk scenario, should we say. And at the same time that we had this work carried out, we used that opportunity to also install insulation and just to make the house warmer and more energy efficient as well. And I was lucky in that my brother works in the industry as a sustainability expert, and he advised me on who to contact and the kind of work that would be beneficial to the property. But on the whole, I think there's a big gap in information out there for homeowners, and a big gap in the market for flood adaptation work. And a lot of people don't know either that their home is at risk or what steps they might be able to take to mitigate that. And also, this kind of work isn't taken into consideration by insurance companies. So even though we've taken these steps to protect our property, there's no reduction in my home insurance premium for having carried out that work. But for me, it's worth it because of the extra peace of mind that it brings to us whenever we have heavy rain. So that's just a little, snapshot of past experience and recent measures that we've taken. The last slide just has my contact details there if anybody wanted to get in touch. I don't know whether you wanted to do any questions on that or move on to the next speaker.
If you don't mind staying on for another 6-7 minutes, Saphia, we're going to I'm going to show a video that shows the sort of the business side of the same story you've told, basically, although everyone's story is different, and then we can do a Q&A if that's all right after that. Thank you very much for that, Saphia. That was a brilliant sort of insight into what it's like. I just can't imagine it happening more than once like that. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this video. It's the Cam Pfr Case Study. They have quite a few to choose from, so we've just chosen one that I think sort of gives a good insight into what happens from start to finish, experiencing a flood, and then what happens afterwards. So, and then we'll do a quick Q&A if that's all right with everyone.
Well, Sue, thank you so much for inviting me into your salon to show me just all you've done to make it flood resilient. First of all, could you tell me a bit about your worst flood, because I know you've lived through a lot of them?
Yeah, and the worst flood was in 2015 on Boxing Day. We couldn't get down to the shop, and eventually the day after, when we did arrive, it was absolute devastation down here. We'd got over 6 foot of water in the salon and structural damage. The water had come through the walls, it had blown the windows out, so a lot of damage, and we did lose absolutely everything in the shop.
And how long were you shut for while the repairs were being done?
Right, we were shut for around about 9 months, but fortunately I was able to secure a place up at another salon which wasn't affected by flooding, so very fortunately they allowed me to go and work up there so I could keep the business going.
So what made you decide to make Adaptations? Was it that big flood? You've been flooded 3 times and you just couldn't take any more, is that it?
Yeah, I mean, when you come back in and stand there and you've lost absolutely everything, and it's your business, it's your livelihood, it's either I pack up and go, but what do I do then? Or we stand there and look and say, right, what can we do? And I worked alongside my landlord, and we put together a plan of how to bring the premises back into working order, and how to make it as resilient as possible.
So could you tell me what you've done? Because I know you flooded in February and you've got a really great story to tell.
Yeah, so when we decided we were going to redo the shop and make it as resilient as possible, we looked at absolutely everything that we could do, and we dug the floors out and concreted the whole floors from front to back. Then we laid stone flag floors. All the electrics were all hired up, so they were sort of about between 3 to 4 feet above floor level. The walls are all rendered with outside render. They were tanked first, so they're all tanked and then rendered, sorry, and then they're all painted. Everything is painted with outside paint. So whatever you would put on the outside of a house or a property, we've put on the inside. All the furniture is either glass, plastic or metal. The kitchen is all plastic. So, nothing gets thrown away from that or damaged. Any little bits of furniture that I have round is all recyclable. So it's all old furniture that we've had painted. So if it gets damaged, we throw it away. We can afford to do that. All the stock can be lifted up, any stock that is low down. We tend not to keep things low down anymore, so anything that is, we can, if we're given adequate warning about floods, then we just come down and lift everything as high as possible. So that resulted in the flood that we had in February, where we had roughly about 3 feet of water in, with minimal losses. We were able to open up within 4 days. And that was, we came in, we power washed everything out, we sanitized everything, and then we had dehumidifiers going day and night, and a big gas flame heater going through the day when we were in here, and that dried everything out. And so, with minimal loss. So it just proves it does work.
So if when you get your flood warning or the siren goes, to come down here to move your stock. You put stock in your car to take home as well, don't you? And then you move everything that you can out of harm's way.
Yeah.
And you think obviously in emergency plans, so you all know what you're going to do in advance. And the fact that you've made the whole place flood resilient has saved you a fortune and a lot of heartache. And would you recommend it to others in your situation?
I think definitely. If you've got a property that is in the valley bottom that's prone to flooding, like this one is, it's the only way forward. You can't keep putting back down. I mean, we don't put carpets down. There's no soft furnishings because you just lose them. So the only bit of carpet is the doormat, and I can afford to buy a new doormat, So, and the one thing about having a property down here and having a business is that we don't get any flood insurance. They just will not insure us. So every time we have to pay to restock or to put it back is out of our pockets. So, you've got to make it as resilient as possible. It's the only way forward, in my view.
Well, I think you've told us an incredibly positive story, and thank you very much for speaking to me.
You're more than welcome.
Right, so we've got two perspectives there, the homeowner's perspective and the business perspective. So I thought it might be nice timing to have a group discussion about that and see if we have any questions for Saphia. And I'm aware there's a couple other people that were meant to be on today that have had their own flooding experiences, so it'd be quite interesting to hear about some things that that you guys have experienced as well. I'm sure everybody's experience is slightly different depending on the property and what sort of business it is, or what whether it's a home or just anyone's motivations for having come today would be nice to hear. So I think what I'm going to do is I think I might stop sharing for a second, because then we can have more of a conversation, if that's all right with everyone. Right. Okay, so did we have any questions for Saphia?
Don't forget to unmute yourself if you're speaking.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point. Or you can, if you prefer to raise your hand, that's absolutely fine. I actually did have a question, Saphia. So when you were flooded the first time and you had to you were displaced and had to go move into your brother's house, what were you able to receive any sort of support with that at all? Like, did you go out and try and find any support?
No, I didn't receive anything. So the flat that I moved out of was rented. So I didn't have any insurance at all because the landlord had buildings insurance. So he was able to get support with the remedial work that was needed. But that's why I ended up basically living in my brother's house, because I couldn't, I didn't have the resources to go and find somewhere else in the short term. So it took me a while to sort of get back on my feet and find somewhere more permanent. And that was when I moved away. I believe there were sort of packages of funding available for different people in different circumstances, but I didn't access any of that. No.
Okay, yeah, so it mainly went to the sort of owner of the building, the support there. Yeah, fair enough. Anton, did you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sorry, I just had a quick one for Saphia. Just obviously with my role, I try to look for construction businesses within our region, etc. So it's just how did you finding any builders or anything to do work on your property? Was it quite an easy find, or did you struggle with that as well?
It was all word of mouth. No, it's not particularly easy. I contacted a few companies that were not willing to work on such a small scale. As I said, the work that we had done was really quite minor. It was a few £100s worth of work, and it was in the end a local builder who was recommended to me. A lot of bigger companies didn't want to take on such a small piece of work, if that makes sense. And I think having some kind of directory for homeowners would be really valuable. People who are registered and reliable to come and carry out this kind of work, because otherwise it's a bit of a lottery. Yeah,
absolutely. Elena?
For your very emotional insight, my question is, so there were several times mentioned the insurance. For example, a friend of your family didn't have has the insurance for 30,000, and this woman from the video told that her house is not insured, their property is not insured because they're prone to flood area. And when you buy a new house, as a house owner, I have an insurance for my house, and you told there was a contradiction. You know that this area was flooded, and it wasn't mentioned in the documents. Do you have any problems with the insurance for your house because of that?
Well, no, we were lucky because there was no record of the house ever having flooded. There was no issue with getting insurance. But then the flip side of that is that might encourage people to not protect themselves and have a false sense of security and be at more risk than they realise. So in my case, obviously, if we did have a big flood here, I would expect the premiums to go through the roof after that, which is what happened for my mum, for my family home. But that's why I would advise people really to do their own investigation, to maybe speak to the neighbours or look at news stories from, for that area to see whether anything like this has ever happened if you're moving to a new area that you're not familiar with, because it could give you a false sense of security, thinking, well, we don't need to insure ourselves, or we don't need to be covered specifically for flooding because it's not a risk in this place.
That's a really good suggestion, actually, looking at news stories. Because yeah, but I mean, you can always, I'll show you in a little bit how you can also look up your flood risk through some existing resources that would help as well. But I think that's a great suggestion. Jamie, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering if you had challenges with any mental health issues after the flood, and in particular after, say, a normal rain event, and how you had managed that, if so.
I mean, I moved away from the area down to London to a place which wasn't, really at any risk at all. But when I moved back here, it was a concern and it was on my mind. And I did notice that after we had that drain installed at the back of the house, I slept easier on nights when we had heavy rain and storms, knowing that that was giving us some measure of protection. So certainly it does, you know, it does help to have those things in place to make, you know, to take away the anxiety of such an event happening again. Now, it doesn't prevent, you know, a sort of catastrophic event happening, but there is, at some point you have to accept the fact that there's so much you can do as an individual to protect yourself, and then the rest is kind of out of your hands. But yeah, I did have some anxiety around, you know, heavy rains, which was what had caused the flooding in Hull in 2007, and it gave us a little bit of peace of mind having that installed.
Yeah, I imagine it did. Yeah, when you're saying, like, you think about a 3 foot of water coming in or 4 foot of water coming in, there's a significant amount you can do to prepare for that, like the woman in the video, but at the same time, it's like that has a cost associated with it as well. So not all homeowners are able to sort of put in that level of flood resilience measures. Did you have another question, Jamie, or are you no, you're done. Okay. Yeah, Elena?
Just to share experience, that Jamie asked about mental issues of being flooded. We weren't being flooded, luckily, but when we moved to Sheffield the next year after that was dramatically flooded and 3 people died because of that, our son, he was 11 by the time, he was really worried about that, and he just asked us directly, so we'd be sure that the house we will live in wouldn't be flooded in the future. So he was scared even watching TV about these episodes. So he thought it's one of the main issues not to be flooded. So I think that even if you're not being flooded directly, the mental issues could be very long. And when we moved in this area, the first question we asked to homeowner when we buy a house was whether you got flood issues here. So I would say that's long-lasting story.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of displacement does, I think, leave its mark, doesn't it? Especially, you know, on people who sort of, especially on people who are disabled or have children, because it's like they've, you know, that kind of displacement can be quite difficult, really, especially since you may not be in suitable accommodation when you move. Well, you weren't, Saphia, were you, for a while in your brother's living room? Did anyone else have any other questions or comments, or just want to tell us about their own flood experience? If not, then I think what we'll do is we will move on. Nope. Okay. Thank you so much, Saphia, for sharing that with us. It was an incredible insight and for answering our questions. Right. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. So moving on. Oh, it's me now. Okay. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what it is that we do at the Flood Innovation Centre, and talk about PFR in general terms, and sort of what the role of PFR is in the sort of flood resilience landscape. Give you an overview of that as well. Tell you about what types of PFR there are. We've already talked about a couple, and I think you'll recognize them when I speak about them, and how to determine your own flood risk, in addition to Saphia's suggestion, and then just give you a little bit of an insight into how we can support with your own PFR implementation. So I've made this little diagram, and yeah, if you don't agree with it, that's fine. We all the terminology can be a little bit, you know, used in different ways throughout the market. But so I've made this little diagram here that just sort of shows where flood risk reduction measures sit. There are some natural ones. We're not going to be talking about those today. We are going to be talking about the property flood resilience measures, which are generally sort of more of a man-made intervention, something manufactured and installed. So we're going to start with resistance measures, and resistance measures are going to be things that actually prevent the water from entering the property at all. So some of the examples of that are shown on the screen. We've got flood doors, which are doors that are sealed all the way around. And then for sort of shorter quantities or shorter heights of water, we've got these barriers that go in front of the door. They just slot into some channels that are installed onto the wall. Self-closing air bricks are really good. You can also get air brick covers if you don't want to have the disruptive construction of putting in a new air brick. And these, just when the water gets inside them, they have a very simple valve that just shuts. And then non-return valves as well, which sort of prevent backflow from the sewers, which is definitely helpful when it comes to the cleanup post flood. And then you've got sort of your temporary measures like sandbags, but we don't really recommend sandbags for lots of reasons, which I'm going to tell you what they are, because I think a lot of people don't really understand why there's such sort of a prejudice against sandbags. But there can be seepage with sandbags, so water can get through. They only work if they're deployed properly. They have to be installed in a certain way to be really effective. Here in this picture, you can see they've just put like a massive pile of them. That would be extremely difficult for most people to do, because number one, they're really bulky to store, so you're not going to have that many on hand. They're very difficult to handle. They're heavy. Not everybody can lift a sandbag. They have a really limited use case as well, so they're only appropriate for sort of shallow, slow moving water, and they only partially hold back the water anyway. While they're in use, they absorb a lot of flood water and all the related sort of contaminants with that, and so they're not suitable for reuse or cleaning. And they're also extremely heavy when they're wet, so you have to wait frequently until they are fairly dry before they can be moved. And I've seen some instances where people have not done that and just left them in situ and just let them sit there to rot to the point where they start to break open and spill their sand all over the place, and then contaminating the environment around where they are. And then of course they're difficult to dispose of for all the reasons that I've sort of outlined above. And so we don't recommend sandbags. There's lots of alternatives that are better, lighter, small, easier to store, stackable, and some of these are listed here. And there's lots of room for innovation in this area as well. If you are innovating in that area, do get in touch with us and we can sort of help you make that go a little bit faster. If you want any more information, just a couple of websites just listed at the bottom left there that you can have a look at: Yorkshire Flood Resilience and the Flood Toolkit. I think those are both from the Pathfinder projects. So the next one I want to talk about is resilience measures. So these are about quick recovery, getting back into the property rapidly. So having a minimal damage as well, so that you're not replacing a huge amount of your property and belongings. And some of those are, as you heard in the video, raised sockets. Sump pumps are really good. I think that's one that Mary Donow does recommend in one of her videos. I'm not sure if it was in that video or another one, but sump pumps are quite good. You just flick them on. Sometimes they're automated, and then they just pump out the water as it's entering the property, and you just keep those going really until the storm event is over. Vinyl flooring, in the video I think they mentioned stone flooring, just any sort of flooring that's going to dry out completely and can just be hosed down. The subfloor also needs to be looked at to make sure that the subfloor is something that will that is resilient as well. You can get different wall treatments and installations. There's types of plasterboard which are flood resilient, which will dry out quickly and not absorb the water, and insulation as well. And then my absolute favorite are suds, and it's debatable where these really sit, but I put them into resilience measures because I think for the external the external parts of your property, because they're generally natural, they're going to deal with a lot of the contamination in the floodwater naturally, and you won't have to do an excessive amount of cleanup to make it safe outside as well. And there's a couple of websites here as well where you can find out a little bit more about flood resilience measures. These are the ones I think that if you can afford them, they're the most highly recommended. They're going to be the better long-term solutions, because, you know, as we've all found, you can build a wall to stop the floodwaters, and that works until the storm that overtops it, which we see quite frequently. And then they build the walls higher and the attenuation basins deeper, and there's a limit to how far we can go with that. So I think there is a living with water element that really needs to be considered. And then, of course, flood planning. So this is being ready when it comes. It can be around understanding your flood risk. So finding out what your actual flood risk, what types of flooding, and I'll go over those in a minute, types of flooding you're prone to, your property is prone to, getting a flood warning. Text is really helpful because that can allow you to know that you need to spring into action with your flood plan, and the flood plan will be bespoke to your property. So basically, and your belongings. So if you need to move valuable things upstairs, for example, or if you need to, you know, move your electrical appliances off the floor, or however your property is sort of laid out. Insurance, make sure you know what your insurance is covering, and make sure that your insurance is appropriate. And there's a lot of work being done about insurance. I'm hoping Cecilia is going to talk about that a little bit in a bit. And then just keep yourself safe. Have a plan to keep yourself safe, whatever is appropriate to your own flood risk and your own property. And you can find out more about those here. So Floodery talks about insurance a bit. So that's a good place to go if you want to understand the work that's being done to improve insurance for people who are prone to flooding. You can find out about that there. And this is the kind of diagram you'll see if you go to, for example, Mary Donnell's site. So this is really nice, actually, I think, to look at and give you some context for where each of these types of flood resilience and resistance measures fit in into your property. So it's just good to have a little look through one of those, and they aren't hard to find. If you just type in property flood resilience and then go into images, you'll see several versions of this diagram. So just really quickly, because I think this is significant to understanding your flood risk, is knowing what types of flooding you're prone to and what the types of flooding are. So firstly, surface water flooding tends to be worse. Well, it is worse, and it happens in urban areas where you have a lot of hard paving and not very many permeable surfaces. The water can't sort of drain off, so it sits on the surface. And then we've got fluvial flooding, which is rivers, when a river breaks its banks, which is frequently occurs in this country. And these tend to be fast moving and destructive. So you're going to need to make sure that any temporary barrier measures you have in place are going to have the strength to withstand those destructive flows. Coastal flooding, these occur not just, unlike surface water and fluvial flooding, which generally occur when there's a large storm event. Coastal flooding can also occur during like a high spring tide or a storm surge offshore. Happened here in 2013, I think it was, and it was pretty significant. It was a spring tide coupled with a storm surge, and it overtopped the defenses and led to significant flooding on the coastal areas on the East Coast. And then groundwater flooding is the UK, many parts of the UK are prone to groundwater flooding because they're underlain by a chalk aquifer, and like in our area, overlain with clay, which does not have a huge amount of porosity, so therefore does not hold a lot of water. So as soon as the aquifer fills, you get water coming from below and up, and in your house that could lead to flooding coming up through your floorboards and that sort of thing. So it's a different type of flooding that you do need to be aware of. And sewer flooding, obviously that's when the sewers have exceeded their capacity to carry water and they back up. This is where you need your non-return valves, and this is where the bulk of the really nasty contamination in flooding comes from. So you do need to be aware, if you have flooded, that it is very likely that there might be some sewer contamination within that. So just be very aware of that when you do your cleanup. So you can find out about which of those your property is prone to by going to check your long-term flood risk. This is a service provided by the Environment Agency. There's the website there. You can see your flood risk for from rivers or the sea, and your flood risk from surface water. I feel like there's groundwater too, and it's on a separate one. But and this just shows you how serious the risk is of the different types of flooding. So, for example, Hessel, this is sort of around where the Ura Innovation Center is really prone to river flooding from the Humber, but not too bad for surface water flooding. There's a few bits where it's probably lower elevations. They have built some attenuation basins which will have alleviated some of that as well. And you can of course sign up for your flood warnings, and the flood warnings are those texts that you get on your phone. I've had one actually, but it was in California and it was an earthquake warning, and I hadn't signed up for anything. They just sort of took over your phone, but I don't think that's been approved in this country yet. So if you want a flood warning, you're going to need to sign up for that. And then there are obviously ways to protect your business once you know a bit more about it. I would highly recommend getting a flood survey, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute from Rob. But when you get a flood survey, there is no sort of regulating body that ensures that the person doing your flood survey has, you know, the qualifications to do that to the level that might be needed. So you do need to do your due diligence. I do recommend what Saphia said about getting, you know, asking around and getting some other people's advice and doing your due diligence on that, because there are people who claim to be able to do a flood survey who are not as qualified as other people. However, we can help with that. Is part of our service. So if you are a small to medium-sized business and you would like to get a flood survey and start to implement some of your own PFR, do get in touch because we can help you with that. And if you want to see any more examples, there's a series of videos called Our Flood Resilient Business, part of the Hazard and Hope series. If you search Hazard and Hope or Our Flood Resilient Business, you should be able to find them. Episode 3 is really good. And on our YouTube channel, I believe we have an example of one of the people in those videos sort of talking about his experience in more depth. So that's it from me. And we're going to move on to Cecilia, and then we'll have a conversation. If you have any questions for me or Cecilia, just hold on to them until she's done, and then we'll talk all together at that point again. Cecilia, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'll share my screen now then.
Okay, yeah, sorry, let me stop sharing. David, can you just make sure Cecilia can share, please?
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. Oh, hello. So I'm Cecilia Deita. I'm a flood recovery researcher, but I have also researched the impacts on flooding on SMEs. So this presentation will focus on the impacts of a small and medium-sized business in general, and we will explore and address also some challenges and opportunities that SMEs have to increase their resilience to flooding. So first, as you all know, SMEs are incredibly important. They are the backbone of the economy. For example, according to the Humber Lab, 98% of the business in a region are class and SMEs, which means that they provide the business base in Yorkshire and Humber. And also it means that employment, goods and services they provide are essential for the community. Therefore, when businesses flood, the impacts can be felt at a community level and at a regional level as well. And for example, the flooding in 2015 and 2016 was estimated to cost the economy 1.6 billion. And the economy losses from flooding between November 2019 and March 2020 are estimated to be about 333 million. So in the UK, the costs of SMEs flooding and the business interruption that this caused and the loss of employment were really significant. And for example, just in Calderdale in 2015, and the Boxing Day floods cost almost 47 million of losses. So it is important, it is very, very important that SMEs do as much as they can to minimize their impacts, not only for them, but for the community and for the economy in general. And why is this important? Well, SMEs can be more vulnerable to flooding, and they can face higher challenges and therefore be disproportionately affected. As well as they are sometimes less prepared than larger firms. And some of the challenges that SMEs face are, for example, financial constraints, especially, for example, in these times after the effects that COVID has had over SMEs. They may be finding harder to survive financial difficulties. They also may face restricted managerial and administrative practice because they may be focused on day-to-day constraints rather than be thinking in preparedness. And they also may have limited assets, not only in premises, but in machinery, in stock, for example. So the impacts that they may suffer from flooding may be more significant. So the impacts that flooding can have over business are diverse and are often difficult to measure. For example, flooding can affect premises and assets in different ways and in different levels. And every flooding is different. So it is difficult to foresee what is the level of damage that SME may have. It can help production, whether because of the machine has suffered damage or the tools have suffered damage, or because of employees may not be ready to access, or the premises may not be easily accessed after a flooding. They can disrupt the demand of products. So even when SMEs may be ready to resume activities, the clients may not be ready to start business again. And they also disrupt the supply chain. For example, constrain the access to raw materials. And in general, they may affect the supply of public services. Some SMEs may find power disruptions or water disruptions. So, and there are also the indirect cost of flooding that SMEs may suffer. For example, the staff may be unavailable for work, the worker productivity can be affected because of distress if they also got flooded in their home premises. And because of, well, not only because they may be busy doing their own recovery activities, but because mental health and distress can be a major factor. And for example, also the customers, if they have certain business models, there can be lack of payments from customers. And particularly in regions, for example, in a research that we carried out of the impacts of 2019 of 2020 on the winter floods in Yorkshire and the Humber, some of the average losses were highest, for example, for equipment, business interruption, and exterior repairs. And And for example, in Cardell Lake, for every 1 pound of direct losses, there was a further 0.63% of indirect losses that are not usually reported because they're difficult to measure. So SMEs need to be prepared because, as we mentioned before, it's not only the direct impacts of the flooding, but also the indirect losses they may suffer. The most common types of damage experienced by business were water supply disruption, changes in the firm's reputation, and availability of workforce. For example, we don't often think in the changes in the firm's reputation, but firms that are prepared may give the customers more security, not only customers, but also suppliers, for example. So you may rather to go to some business that you know that will be prepared if they have a flooding. So in average, business in this region closed their premises for 13 days, and there was a 30% reduction of the monthly sales afterwards. So the impacts that flooding can cause are varied. For example, in Cockermouth, and it also, the impacts that the flooding cause, it also depends, for example, on the time of the year. For example, in 2009 in Cockermouth in Cumbria, the flooding was in November, so business were probably stocked the Christmas. They probably have the Christmas stock for the Christmas sales, and these affected incredibly their business rates and their sales because people, you know, that is one of the, for many businesses, one of the times that they increase sales. So having closed during these times and having stock damage during these times was incredibly hard. For example, SMEs ranked their impacts, and for them, one of the most difficult parts was the customers couldn't travel to the premises, because this is also a region that benefits from tourism, for example. But they also have one of the worst damages were additional costs, and the stocks and products damage were spoiled, and that decreased the, well, everything decreased their sales. But for example, one of the things that they can do to prevent damage is prevent damage to the stock. For example, there are things that is difficult to manage or difficult to be prepared or prevent, like travel difficult for customers, but we can't concentrate in the things that we can do, like preventing loss of stock. And now to talk about recovery and what can we do to manage and what can influence recovery? Well, being prepared is one of the most important things, that one of the things that we can do. And being prepared means that we also consider, for example, what are the flood characteristics. For example, Hiatt mentioned that depending on the type of flood, it's also will cause different kind of damage and different kind of measures that we can use. So what can influence our recovery? For example, how much do we know of the risk and how prepared are we? It has been seen that businesses that have been previously flooded are better prepared, or can be better prepared to manage a future flooding. So that is important. Even if you haven't been flooded, you can still increase your level of knowledge and preparedness. You can keep monitoring and warning, and you can subscribe to flood alerts. Yeah, your flood experience in general, not only on your own flooding, but for example, your neighbor's flooding, and knowing what they experience and what they've been through. The level of support can influence flood recovery, not only in grants, but only also having insurance and having community support after a flood, and appropriate governance in general, that's a community level. And also, well, your intrinsic vulnerabilities. What type of business do you have? How well prepare you were you, how dynamic is the management during the recovery, and how willing are you to be flexible, for example. Other opportunities for resilience and recovery. Well, business have various advantages that can make them resilient and give them advantages over larger business. For example, they can avoid bureaucracy and can be flexible and be ready to take measures and take innovative measures for themselves, because they can be flexible and they can adapt to changes, and also can install tailored PFR measures according to their own needs and the own needs of the property. They can foster innovation and increase their learning capacity. And they can also use the close relationship they have with customers. So they can adapt to the market and foresee what they will need to do in case of a flood. And in general, get support from the local community institutions, for example, like FIC, and that is offering the help to be prepared. Thank you. That will be all.
Very much. Sorry, I was muted and had my my video off. Thanks very much for that, Cecilia. Okay, so I think we're going to move now to some Q&A. I'm going to just share my screen again. Right, so I've got up on the screen here just adapted from the Syria Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience, just a diagram that sort of shows the flow of events that you would sort of follow if you were going to adopt some property flood resilience measures on your property. So you're welcome to have a look at that and just think about the steps within that. But in the meantime, did anybody have any questions for either me or Cecilia? Sorry, I can't see my meeting controls for some reason. Oh, sorry.
Do you have one from Joanne?
Yeah, Joanne, can you unmute yourself there?
Hi.
Hi.
One of the questions I've got, and it's kind of just stemmed from literally the beginning of this session through to now, is what type of building construction are you all recommending these resilience measures for? This is one of the biggest concerns I've got. Are you recommending it for all building constructions, or have you got a specific building construction in mind here?
Well, it obviously depends on your flood risk, really, but if you're in a flood prone area, then it's something that you definitely need to address with a property survey. That I think would, be the starting place. It's not our specific job to recommend, a specific measure for a specific place, but we would definitely encourage all building construction who are in flood risk areas to know their flood risk, if you know what I mean, and to find out what measures are most appropriate for their property.
No, I appreciate that, but all of the measures you've been recommending are not appropriate at all for traditional construction, and that's a key gap. And it's great what you're recommending for cavity wall construction. It's great what you're recommending for buildings of modern construction, but any building normally pre-1919 of traditional construction, the stuff you're recommending is actually really damaging and could actually result in these buildings being far worse condition than if they flooded. And I think that's a key area, not just with you, but also with the PFR, with Fleury, with DEFRA, EA, is that you're not recognising that actually there is better options for traditional buildings that is far more resilient. So using a natural breathable material and resilient on a traditional building, it will dry out in 2 weeks. If you're going to tank it and put concrete in, it's going to take several months. It's then going to structurally cause issues with the building. And that's, I think if you're going to say to people, these are your resilience measures, you really need to clarify these are for buildings that are not of traditional construction.
Okay, so what sort of things would you use on a traditional constructed building?
So anything that can breathe. So if you use any lime plasters or lime renders, which you should be using anyways, gypsum's automatically going to stop the building breathing. You're holding damp into the stone or the brick or the cob, depending on what it's constructed of. Same as concrete floors, you're going to end up with structural issues. They don't breathe. So using natural floors like a limecrete or just paving, quarries, limestone paving, all of that naturally dries. It's very easy to remove. Lime's also naturally acidic, so it will get rid of all of the decontaminants for you. So as soon as you have all this toxic flood water in, it naturally just gets rid of it. So there's loads of different measures you can do, as well as some of the ones that were pointed out by Mary, is having a resilient downstairs. So if you make sure you have like oak furniture, that dries out a lot better than MDF. So there are a lot of measures that are similar, but it's just saying anything you do to the building, the actual building, like tanking, that is like the most detrimental thing you can do to traditional building.
Right.
And it's just, I've literally been hacking off downstairs a slate course that someone's put in and bitumen asphalt on my groundstairs cobble, and I've had 2 of the walls collapse because it's held all the water in.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's just the understanding.
No, that's really interesting. No, that's interesting. And to be perfectly honest, that is the first time that it's really come up in, you know, for us. Are those measures you can use for like listed buildings as well?
Yeah. So that's what I do. I sit on the DEFRA roundtable. So I actually do work in flood construction. I work on listed buildings. I work on traditional buildings.
Is it historic England, is it, that you're from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all of these would work for listed buildings, but it's not just listed, it's anything traditional. So you've got to think that's 30% of the market, 30% of our building stock is traditional construction. So that's where it's that understanding that actually 30% of the buildings we already are managing, and majority of them are in flood risk. Like a lot of the buildings you were showing from Hull, are all traditional buildings. And the same with Cumbria. I'm working with Appleby at the moment. 90% of those are traditional buildings. So it's really important we kind of identify that in the hazard assessment and in the property survey.
Absolutely. Okay, Rob's nodding his head. Did you want to come in on that, Rob?
Yeah, I just really wanted to agree with Joanne there, and I think that really emphasises the need to have a property survey done to really identify both the construction of the building to determine what sort of measures might be suitable, but also then to identify the risks, what the risks are, and then to understand whether, you know, what sort of measures are actually suitable for the construction nature, age of the property, and traditional buildings come under that umbrella really. So it's it's also thinking about, you know, if a property is listed, there might be constraints in terms of what you're actually able to do in terms of property flood resilience. So if you're wanting to put flood barriers on external doors, you might not actually be allowed to do that if it doesn't match the exterior appearance if it's listed. So these sorts of things can all be identified by actually having, you know, a qualified surveyor come out and survey the property and identify all those issues. So yeah, I was just agreeing with Joanne really.
Absolutely, and that's why, I mean, we say that we're providing this service of properties flood survey. We're not actually providing that. We're getting people who are qualified like Rob to come and do that for us, because, you know, we have our areas of expertise, but mine is not in, you know, certainly not in traditional construction. So it's actually really good to have that input, Joanne, and we might actually have to ask you to come and do one of our some delivery for us on a workshop or a webinar, because it is actually really a fantastic point of view that we hadn't really explored in any depth. So thank you very much for that.
That's fine. I'd be happy to. I'm actually presenting on flooding in urban environments on Friday.
Brilliant. Oh,
it's one of my key things. We've kind of joked about my title. It's kind of changed. I'm now disaster and resilience of traditional buildings.
Well, that's brilliant, because that, like I said, that's not an insight we've had a whole lot of input on. So really appreciate you coming on today and giving us your expertise. Elena, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to support Joanne's point of view, and one more time highlight that the starting point is survey, because not all, for example, if we use the long flooding maps for Environment Agency, they don't fix sometimes the surface water or groundwater flood risk. And if you start with the survey, you'll find out that the recommendations, for example, for floors, it was an example raised up, for floors, they're not like a strict recommendation, use only tile soot, which is not permeable and easy to high pressure cleaning. There is a slash for use materials which dry easily, like oak floors, oak furniture. And that's the same for walls. You can put it in plastic. That means that your walls will be not permeable, but vice versa. You can put a special membrane which prevents the houses from soaked and makes it easier to dry out. And so the same for the furniture. There are two ways or finding furniture is to find materials which are easily recyclable. For example, if you got a kitchen, you can make the entire borders from plastic or from cheap borders and just throw it away after each flood because they're cheap. But vice versa, you can use iron kitchen, totally made of metal, not iron, made of metal, made of plastic, or made of oak. That means all these types of furniture will just bounce back very fast, so you wouldn't need to spend more money. And for the listed buildings, we got the insight from Aquabex. They got special projects. So, for example, if listed building wants to install flood protection doors, they can't just take anything from the market. Yeah. It must be in line with the recommendations. So, so that works for each building. There must be individual and bespoke projects how to make this property flood resilient. And that's a very good issue where to start. That's what Hiatt diagram showed. So starting point, it's always survey. And then based on the recommendations of the survey, which Rob will take us later, you can accept or reject any recommendations, and with also PFR measures, and alongside with that, we'll go for the contractors who make it available for you. That's kind of good practice, looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point. I think it's and I think we're going to hear from Rob next, and he'll give us a little bit more insight into how that process goes. So I think what we'll do, if nobody has any pressing questions, we'll move on to Rob now, because I feel like that his talk might generate some more questions, and I'd like to leave some time for that if possible. So if you do have anything pressing, feel free to put it in the chat. Everybody should have access to the chat. All right, I'm just going to share my screen. Rob, do you mind just telling me when to go ahead? All right.
Yeah, that's fine. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Rob. I'm a flood risk consultant and surveyor at Flood Protection Solutions. So we undertake property surveys for, private householders, but commercial clients as well. So a key part of that is actually going out and doing the property survey itself, which I'll kind of explain in a bit more detail. So kind of the title of my section here is really kind of good practice, but that really incorporates the flood survey. I just had a little look online before this, and Aviva actually did some research last year that shows that a third of commercial properties in the UK are at risk of flooding, but less than 40% actually have flood insurance, and less than 20% have any suitable resilience or flood mitigation measures. So there's clearly a lot more work to be done to make sure that commercial properties, SMEs, have suitable measures in place to protect themselves from flooding and make themselves resilient. Another item, which again I'll address a bit later on, is 75% of businesses don't have a business continuity plan. So coming back to the items that Cecilia raised in terms of making sure your business can kind of carry on running and get back up and running following a flood, the majority of businesses don't have a plan in place to be able to do that. So that's obviously a key concern going forward as flood risk increase. Next slide, please. So this again is just looking at kind of preparation and being aware of the impact. So again, these are things that were covered previously, just understanding that it's not just the financial costs, there's disruptions of business operations, continuity, you need to be temporarily relocated. You can be out of a premises for months on end, basically. It's not a quick turnaround a lot of the time if you're not prepared for it. And there's also the mental health aspects and the mental well-being of both business owners and their staff from the disruption you can cause, and just the concern that could potentially happen again. Next slide, please. So the key thing really for us that we want to promote to SMEs and homeowners as well is having a property flood survey done. This is really the key initial step to understanding what measures might be suitable. So a flood survey typically comprises a visit by myself or one of my colleagues, a surveyor, or another firm will come out and assess a property, assess a site, looking at the construction, looking at the drainage, trying to understand kind of sources of flood risk. We'll then, once we've done the survey, kind of pick up on kind of areas of risk at the site itself. We'll go away and review the kind of wider flood risk. So that's looking at the Environment Agency maps. In some instances, we can collect better data from the Environment Agency. Not all their data is online. So we might be able to obtain better data from the Environment Agency to get better gauge what the potential flood depths will be. And then we need to bring all that together to make an assessment of what sorts of measures will likely be most suitable. So it depends on both the property and the risks. So obviously, if you've got deep fluvial flooding or you've got deep tidal flooding, property flood resilience, so flood barriers, flood doors are probably not going to be suitable because they're just going to become overtopped. So then we start looking into flood resilience areas really. If you've got shallower surface water flooding, then keeping the water out of a property might be suitable. Going back to the points Joanne just raised, if it's a traditional property, some of the harder flood mitigation measures, resistance measures, keeping water out of property isn't going to be suitable for that form of construction. There's also looking at other sources of risk, so groundwater risk. Obviously, you've got a risk potentially water comes up through the floor, so you might need to look at the floor construction. It might be quite difficult to mitigate that risk without tearing up the floor and relaying everything. So it depends. It varies from property to property. It varies from site to site, depending on the risk. So we'd always recommend that the initial step is that a flood survey is undertaken, because that will identify the specific risks to the property and any specific concerns relating to construction, location, kind of local topography, ground form, anything that might be exacerbating the risk or might actually be reducing the risk compared to what's shown on Environment Agency mapping. So a site-specific property survey really is the kind of the initial step. And from there, we can set out a range of different measures depending on what's most suitable for the client. Obviously, they might have a budget in mind. So then they can choose kind of what sort of measures they feel will be best suited for them based on their budgets and their requirements. So that's certainly the best initial step. So once we've gone to that stage, I think we brought it up previously. We then move on to the options development phase, and then once you've picked your kind of final option, then go through to construction and kind of implementing it on site. So once you've got your measures in place, there's kind of the next stage is then kind of managing that and making sure you're prepared for when it does happen. So if we could have the next slide, please. So part of that is having a flood plan. And again, we highlighted this earlier in terms of Mary Donow's kind of resources. The Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales provide their own templates for businesses and homeowners in terms of preparing a flood plan. So it's good that people are aware of these, download them and put it in place. And it's always better to be proactive on these things. We'd always say, go away after this presentation and check your flood risk and see and make sure you're being proactive and getting these things in place before a flood rather than having the pain of having to rectify everything afterwards. So those are two key documents. There's a couple of links there where you can download them. If you just search personal flood plan or business flood plan online with the Environment Agency or Natural Resources Wales, there's some good templates there. And again, Mary Donald's got her own template as well, which you can use. So they're all good resources to kind of making sure you're one step ahead before flooding happens. So next slide, please. Part of that is making sure you're aware. So again, it's all part of being prepared. So there's the Environment Agency Flood Warning Service, Natural Resources Wales have their own. Again, SEPA in Scotland have their own. Obviously, they provide warnings and alerts when heavy rainfall is due. It's typically it only covers river flooding. So you've got to be aware that some sources of flooding you might not get a warning for that sort of flooding, surface water particularly, in which case you might need to take your guide from other sources. So that's where the Met Office might come in handy. They have their own warning service for heavy rain, thunderstorms. That might provide a good indication of when surface water flooding could be likely, but obviously you get a different type of warning. So being aware of all these things that might be able to inform you of when you need to be ready for a flood. Next slide, please. And then the final thing is really just kind of continual good practice and management to ensure you're always kind of fully ready for a flood. So key thing we'll always promote is maintenance. So that's clearing out your drains. But if you do have flood mitigation or resilience measures installed, making sure that they're all in good condition, that they operate, and will work as intended. So that's kind of is fitting them, making sure, as I say, making sure they're in good condition. And just being prepared, because you don't want the scenario where you get a flood warning, you go to fit your flood barrier or implement your flood action plan, and you find that the measures you've got in place are not ready or suitable to be effective. So good maintenance and always being proactive. So just reviewing anything that might have changed and might impact your business's flood or flood resilience. So I've noted a few things here, just making sure you're aware, if you make any changes to your premises, if you knock out a door and put a new door in, have you considered, what impact that might have on the flood risk to the property? Has the way your business operates in terms of what service it provides, has that changed at all in any way? And does that affect how you might need to implement certain flood resilience measures? And then the final point there is really just kind of being proactive. So practicing your flood, kind of implementing your flood plan. So whether that's deploying flood measures or kind of running through your business continuity plan to ensure you're ready, if the worst happens and a flood hits your business. Run through that all very quickly, and I know the key point really is the flood survey. So I'm happy to take any questions in terms of what's involved. Those kind of last few slides are really kind of, the onus is really on the business owner at that point to kind of make sure that they're ready. But the initial step from our side is the property survey. So any questions you might have on those bits, I'll be happy to answer. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry. I was just looking at the chat to see if there was anything in particular in the chat. There's not. Did anyone have any questions for Rob? Yeah, Elena? Oh, yeah.
So first question, I think one of the most important one. If I as a business would like to start from the very beginning to find a surveyor, how to avoid cowboy builders and people who are just imposters. So how to define the proper surveyor from people who wouldn't know their job properly?
Yeah, it's tricky because the market isn't regulated as well as it should be, but hopefully there's going to be some improvement over the coming years. So the Chartered Institute for Water and Environmental Management have just started implementing a property flood resilience training scheme. So hopefully within the next 2 to 3 years, there'll start to be kind of surveyors appearing who've got a specific qualification, which will, certify them to come and do property flood resilience surveys, so do the property survey, but also do the reporting side of things and the recommendations. So that's one thing in place. Unfortunately, one thing that does happen is a lot of the time you essentially get salesmen come out and do these surveys. So they'll come and try and pitch you their specific product rather than being impartial. So there needs to be really a distinction between the property survey, which is identifying the risks to the property and what mitigation measures there are, and then kind of implementing that separately, rather than there being a push from the surveyor side to push a particular measure. They might be selling those certain products. So I agree, there's a gap there that needs to be filled really, in terms of making sure that people aren't being exploited and that the measures that are being recommended are the most suitable ones, not just the ones that the company that comes out that does the survey provide. So yes, it is an issue, but hopefully, if clients or business come to a business company like ours for the survey, and there's other consultants as well who will do the survey and the risk assessment impartially, And then it's up to them to decide if they wanted to shop around to implement mitigation measures. And there's, there shouldn't really be any pressure from the surveyor to go down a particular route. It should really be impartial.
Just the other part of this question, do you collaborate with insurance companies? Maybe the insurance company could point out the proper
yes, so we get some inquiries through insurance companies. Again, it's one of these areas where there's not a fixed database really of companies that are necessarily qualified, but hopefully we'll get to that point soon because of this SIWEM training route. There'll be a list of surveyors who are qualified, or companies where they've got personnel who've gone through this training route. So that'll be the good resource, hopefully, to allow businesses and homeowners to find suitable consultants and surveyors.
My second question is what to expect. For example, I go for the survey, how physical it is. So to go online to register, and what will go next. So how the physically survey is going on.
So the survey itself, so we obviously have to come visit the site. So it's a survey of the building. So both inside and out, typically. It should be identifying all sorts of routes of ingress for water, both through the walls, through the floors, windows, anything like that, or any kind of routes through the walls. But also considering the wider site, so considering flow routes across the wider site or anything of that nature, which might be exacerbating the risk. So everything's got to be considered holistically, really. A site visit's always necessary to identify what suitable measures, what measures are going to be most suitable. It is a hands-on survey. Typically it can take a few hours depending on the size of the site. It varies, and then we need to go away and kind of review that against the risk to identify what the most suitable measures are likely to be.
Thank you very much.
Right. Anybody else have any questions for Rob? I do have a question now. It's a new question for me. What sort of measures would you sort of recommend for traditional construction?
We'd typically be recommending a flood resilient approach, which is kind of the route Joanne was mentioning. So again, avoiding things like tanking. You want to allow the water to breathe, especially if there's stone walls. You've got lime mortar. You go out to so many properties and you see someone they've done some repointing and they've repointed with cement mortar, and you kind of bang your head against the wall. On the pun. And so there's in some instances, depending on the construction, it might be a traditional building with an extension, and the extension might be a more modern construction. So it might be that flood resistance measures might be suitable at the extension, and then a different approach needs to be taken in the traditional part of the property, and there might be a difference in floor levels, and all these sorts of little things might need to be considered. One thing we'd always recommend, particularly if deeper flooding is an issue, is protecting against sewer surcharge, so backflow protection measures, because the walls will naturally resist a certain depth of water or hold back a certain depth of water, and so will any door. You can get heritage flood doors as well, but water could surcharge through the drains back.
Sorry, I missed the last bit. What was the last thing?
Sorry, I was just saying that traditional properties, obviously the walls will naturally hold back a certain depth of water.
Okay.
But you might still get surcharge coming through the drains. So obviously you've got a foul drain coming up your toilets and your kitchens. So they're an external area. So you want to stop the water pushing back through into your property. So backflow protection measures. So non-return valves, as mentioned before.
Oh, okay. Okay. Would those have to be put in sort of quite far from the property, or can they be put in sort of near to the?
It depends on the drainage layout. So again, it's something we'll try and ascertain during property survey. Sometimes it's not always possible to do that. Sometimes a separate drainage survey might need to be undertaken. So we've got a full understanding of all the drainage connections. You need to be putting measures all in the kind of covering the whole property. So making sure every outlet is covered, because if you just put it in one and there's another outlet, there's still a risk that it surcharges at another location.
Okay.
So it's, yeah, as I say, it's considering everything holistically and getting as much
Yeah.
information as possible. So if we, if we went to do a survey and we weren't able to identify all the drainage connections, we'd recommend having a full drainage survey then undertaken and subsequently reviewed to ensure our measures are comprehensive.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, during your risk assessments, do you ever find yourself recommending raising a property or recommending that someone move the property or not live in the specific location in which they are?
We get instances where sometimes the risk is just unavoidable, basically. So we just, where, if it's a traditional property in an area of high risk and there's just no means of keeping the water out, we just have to say, flood resilience is your only way of managing this. And that does unfortunately happen in some instances. People get their hopes up that they'll be able to keep the water out, but it's not always possible, unfortunately. In terms of raising levels, it could be possible. We'd need input from a structural engineer, whether that's suitable. Obviously, you've got to think of headroom requirements as well at ground floor level. Raising door thresholds can be a simple issue if that's achievable. Obviously, you might have to replace all the doors, but at ground level, especially if the flooding isn't too deep, you could raise all the thresholds and just increase the step across into the internal levels. That can stop water spilling in. Obviously, it just depends on specific properties. It varies from site to site.
I have another question. We're looking to build a marketplace to sort of connect all the different industry experts, and I'm just wondering how you think you could potentially connect with users of some shared marketplaces, such as like Airbnb, to help ensure that those properties or businesses offer resilient stays for their guests.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea in terms of going forward, making sure that holiday lets, business owners have a resource to go to, so that they can find suitable surveyors to survey their properties, review their properties, assess the risk, and make sure they've got appropriate plans in place to mitigate it.
Yeah, I'm just interested to know if do you think it might be possible to get to these companies like Airbnb to have like a verified little check mark on the property to see if they had a risk assessment, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think something like that would be beneficial. Obviously, having a report undertaken by a qualified surveyor, that a lot of that kind of pushes into the area of kind of flood insurance. So hopefully in the UK, we're hoping that the flood insurance market moves to a stage where properties which have had flood property surveys undertaken and flood resilience measures put in place, that insurers will begin to recognise that and reduce premiums for homeowners and businesses over time. It's not quite there at the moment. We've got the flood re-scheme, which reduces costs once you've been flooded. But hopefully, insurers, the aim is, there's a Build Back Better scheme. So for properties that have been flooded, ensuring that insurers recognise the need to improve a property and increase its resilience, rather than just put there and allow it to happen again and again and again. So hopefully, certainly in the UK market, the flood insurance market will help to address that over time.
Yeah, hopefully. I know there's a lot of work being done sort of collaboratively in the flood resilience space to sort of get to a point where everyone's sort of working towards the same goal of getting as many people flood resilient and living with water as possible. So unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much, Rob. That was really enlightening. Whoops, sorry about that. I just really wanted to finish up with saying that once again, we will be procuring the services of people like Rob to help us support sort of this new capability that we have as the Flood Innovation Centre to help businesses with their own property flood resilience. And if you want to learn more about that, or you want to get registered with us so that we can hopefully set up a survey for you and get to work on improving your property flood resilience, probably the best thing to do would be go to our website, which is floodinnovation.co.uk, and use the inquiry button just to send an inquiry through. That will make its way to Anton, who has been on here today as well, and he is the person you'll probably speak to first at the Flood Innovation Centre. We also, starting after the Easter holidays, are going to be having a drop-in session at the Aura Innovation Centre on a Friday, midday sort of time. If you just want to come in and get a coffee and find out what it is that we do, or find out what Aura Innovation Centre does, you're welcome to do that as well. And we'll start sending out socials on that. So make sure you're following us on our various channels. I don't think I have anything more to say on that. My contact details are on there as well if you'd like to get in touch with me, or anybody at the Flood Innovation Centre, please do so. Thank you very much for coming today. It's been really, really good, and I think we've had a pretty holistic view of it in general. So do get in touch if you have any further questions. Thank you.